Okay, so this week we're going to be covering concepts, constructs, and operations. The broader topic that we're going to be considering this week really are the observations that you make during the conduct of research. What are the kind of things that you actually deal with, the objects of the research process? So let's start off with considering what we mean by concepts, constructs, and operations, and why they're important to consider. Now, if you recall back to the philosophy of science lecture that we covered, we talked about the notion of critical realism. And within the framework of critical realism, the world is broken up into three kind of what Bhaskar referred to as a tripartite. We have the underlying kind of causally efficacious realm. This is where kind of abstract ideas about mechanisms for the phenomena that ultimately happen in the actual real world occur. And then we have the kind of empirical world where we can actually observe the effects of these underlying causal mechanisms acting within the real world. Now, you can think of concepts, constructs, and operations as loosely falling within those three categories as well. Concepts refer to the kind of abstract ideas of our research endeavours. So, for example, in an area that I've worked in historically in resistance training, we often deal with the concept of strength. So this is a broad, general, abstract idea that we can come up with a definition for. Now, the constructs then often refer to the concepts as they exist in the real world, the actual reference of those concepts. So for example, we might say that individuals exhibit some capacity for strength, to produce strength performances. We then have operations, which are the empirical observations of these constructs and related concepts out there in the empirical domain. So for example, we could say that individuals, we have an idea of this concept strength, individuals possess this ability, this concept that we're interested in, therefore there is a actual manifestation of it, there is the construct strength. And then we could think about an operation we could perform in order to empirically observe the effects of this underlying abstract concept and construct. So that could be, for example, a one repetition maximum test. So concepts, constructs, and operations are all inherently linked with one another in this way. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a epistemological framework known as operationalism, which became very predominant. A physicist named Percy Bridgman was the one who kind of popularized this approach. And within operationism, concepts and constructs are subsumed within operations. So you can think of this as almost falling under more either a sort of constructivist or positivist type lens, where in actual fact, when you take the strong form of operationism, in essence, the measurement approach or the operational method that we use to generate empirical observations are what define the concepts themselves. So within strong operationism, it doesn't make sense to ask questions about whether or not a measurement or observation approach is valid or not, because as long as we perform it, then whatever it is that it allows us to observe is valid for. So it's tautological in that sense. However, if we take this broader kind of realist approach to science, then we deal with these abstract ideas and concepts and constructs that exist within our theories, and operations are intended to be indicators empirically of those constructs and concepts. Now, Cronbach and Meehl in the 50s, they came up with or proposed something called the nomological network, which situates these concepts and constructs and operations or empirical observations within a network of interrelated ideas. So the nomological network, in their approach to what they refer to as construct or concept validity, basically is where our scientific theories are situated such that we have our abstract ideas and concepts, our theoretical units within them. They're reflected within actual constructs, and we propose certain relationships between the different concepts and constructs within our theory. But they also exhibit some proposed relationships with observable manifestations of them. That is to say, empirically observable phenomena that we can perform operations of observation on. Now, I use the term observation deliberately here as opposed to measurement per se, because the operations we perform to gain empirical observations do not have to be quantitative in nature, they can be qualitative in nature. And in fact, different constructs, as we discussed in the methodologies lectures and workshop, can be observed via either qualitative or quantitative means in many cases. So, it's worthwhile, again, thinking about the kinds of philosophical assumptions that you make and bring to the research that you conduct, whether or not you think that things such as concepts and constructs are relevant ideas to employ in your research, or whether you are interested in observations qua observations, the observations and the methods you use to capture empirical observations in and of themselves. So to follow on from the example earlier, some researchers within sport and exercise science who work within the topic of resistance training will often deliberately define strength as the 1 repetition maximum test. And this could be said to be a case of strong operationalism. For them, strength is the 1 rep max operation that's performed. Not, in the other case, which would be a more realist stance, that the 1 rep max operation is an indicator empirically of the strength construct and concept. So it's worth thinking about these things because, again, these sorts of assumptions and these ideas then become relevant for the types of questions that you ask of the kinds of operations and observations that you perform within your research.